10 years ago, almost every superhero movie became a big hit. Realism of the special effects reached a new level and it added visual appeal to movies about people in tights. These days, we have some frustrating failures, which happens due to the fact that audiences have had enough movies about superpowers. If you look closely, you can see that superhero movies do not differ much from each other, and attempts to experiment do not always give the desired result. But in the 90s and early noughties, things were much worse for comic book adaptations. Special effects were crude and rather pushed away audience, plots did not shine with originality. Because of attempts to guess direction of the comic book movies, studios have often obtained frankly failed projects. About several high-profile failures I want to talk today. Let's start with the double failure of Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd of 1995 is a perfect example of a failure that only one person can lead to. Especially if that person is Sylvester Stallone. Sly was known for his obsession with interfering in every project he starred in. He often hired pocket directors and essentially directed films by himself. But failure of Judge Dredd became so big that it became the last Stallone movie where the studio let him do anything. Originally, the movie could have been completely different. Arnold Schwarzenegger had his eye on Dredd for a long time, and Christopher Walken was supposed to play the main villain. But Arnold in those years was at the peak of his career and did not suffer from a shortage of roles offers. In the end, Arnie wanted to work once again with James Cameron and left to True Lies. This is where Sly picked up this role. Stallone was not interested in comics before and never read anyone, because he considered them incredibly stupid. Stallone accepted the role precisely because of Arnold's refusal. Sly was constantly trying to steal movie from his main rival. Since Stallone's career started failing down, and Schwarzenegger's career, on the contrary, was on top. With the arrival of Sly, in film arrival and some problems. First, Stallone immediately rewrote the script, added humor and several characters responsible for it. This is how Rob Schneider's character appeared. Due to the fact that Sly was not familiar with the original, and in spite of shooting in the film, he was not going to get acquainted with it, he considered the original story too gloomy and insisted on expanding the comedic component. Secondly, Stallone had a constant fight with Danny Cannon, the director of the film. Cannon didn't want to give up the director's chair, and Sly criticized Cannon's every action in retaliation. Producers were afraid to get involved in the conflict and don't argue with Stallone, because if the actor left, they would lose extra $50 million that studio had signed out for Superstar. Third, fans criticized the movie for the fact that Dredd appears without a helmet too often in film. This point was already insisted upon by the studio. Since Stallone in the helmet would be useless and he could have been replaced by absolutely any actor. In the end, through constant changes in the script and constant scandals on the set, Stallone and Cannon produced a film which was already trashed at test screenings, and ratings committee gave an adult rating. In expectation of a colossal failure, studio sent Judge Dredd for reshoots. Rumor has it that Danny Cannon was no longer allowed into reshoots and final editing, and that Sly personally supervised them. But no matter how hard Stallone tried, he did not manage to make a film with a teen rating. Because of the requirements of rating committee, many things would have had to be cut out of the film and it would have turned out in parts of incomprehensible scenes. As a result, a severely cut Dredd went to the box office, where failed. On a budget of $90 million, film made only $113 million. The planned trilogy was immediately cancelled and everyone tried to forget about failure. The studio remembered about Dredd after the success of Iron Man and Marvel's transformation into a successful movie studio. Everyone immediately wanted to do the same and started pulling rights to various comics out of their basements. Their Judge Dredd was taken out, too. Then someone remembered that first attempt to adapt Dredd failed because of the anger of fans, and in the reboot producers decided to work out all remarks. Talented screenwriter Alex Garland, who was a fan of comics and was considered to be the best screenwriter in the world, After the Beach and 28 Days Later, was invited for that. To help Garland, studio invited Duncan Jones, who was also considered a rising star after Moon and Source Code. But Jones refused to direct the film, not because Garland's script was bad, but because he had his own vision for Dredd. The studio would not let him show that vision, because Garland had more weight in the eyes of the producers. After Jones left, Pete Travis, known for Vantage Point, was put in the director's chair. And here was a major mistake, the same as in the movie with Stallone. Although Travis is nominally listed as a director, according to Carl Urban, who played the leading role, Alex Garland managed the shooting. Travis sometimes tried to raise his voice and argued with Garland, but producers immediately put him in his place and sent him to shoot the plaster that falling off from walls. All these conflicts led to the fact that Travis not participating in post-production and editing the film. It is not known whether he left on his own or was suspended, but somehow or other, Alex Garland can be called the true author of the film. Test screenings of the film were disgusting, and the studio sent the movie to reshoots allocating for it $2 million. There was not enough money to correct all remarks and the film was released in cinemas, where it failed. On a budget of $50 million, the film made $41 million. Which is odd, considering the pretty good reviews from audiences and critics. It is because of the good reviews that rumors of a possible Dredd sequel keep popping up, at least in the form of a TV series, but since these rumors are spread by Carl Urban alone, it is highly improbable. I'd also like to remember biggest failure of the pre-Marvel era, Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin. If Tim Burton's first Batman was an undeniable hit, the second one already brought Warner Brothers studio a lot of trouble. The dark and creepy film scared young viewers, angered their parents and raised a lot of questions from advertisers. They say McDonald's released a Happy Meal themed series here, and no one takes them apart, because kids have psychological trauma and instead of eating hamburgers, they look at colored spots in the psychologist's office. Anyway, after that Burton was politely, but insistently asked to leave the director's chair. Instead studio hired Joel Schumacher, and on the set of Batman Forever he showed himself competent, and most importantly, the executive director. And so, the set of the next part was practically taken over by the producers, along with promoters, and Schumacher only had to follow the instructions of people with money. More and more characters and gadgets were added to Batman and Robin in order to sell them as merchandise. An obscene number of dubious jokes were mixed into the serious story. According to the actor's story, Schumacher told them that they were making a big, expensive commercial, and therefore, they should not play everything completely seriously. Every fan of The Dark Knight knows what happened in the end. Batman and Robin remain to this day one of the most hated comic book movies in the history of cinema. It was nominated for 11 Golden Raspberries, though the film only won one, and that went to the unlucky Alicia Silverstone for her role as Batgirl. The film's failure didn't just hit Silverstone, who was considered a rising star. Chris Donald drowned in TV series. And George Clooney barely made it back to Hollywood, and that was because he was already signed to several films and because of his friendship with Coen brothers and Steven Soderbergh. Years later, almost everyone involved in the project publicly regretted their participation, and Joel Schumacher even apologized to fans of Batman. But the movie has defenders too, who praise Batman and Robin for the decorations, lighting and stunts. Indeed, the movie is so vivid that it looks more like a Cirque du Soleil show. The failures of Batman and Robin and Judge Dredd caused many studios to quickly shut down development of all superhero movies. A few years later, the faith in comic books would be restored by Blade, and the success of the X-Men would reinforce that faith. Exactly after X-Men, 20th Century Fox Studios remembered they had the rights to Daredevil, which went alongside with the mutants. And the success of Spider-Man solidified the desire to put Daredevil in work. Initially, Vin Diesel was considered for the lead role, but he favored the Chronicles of Riddick. Then producers continued to look for actors, but no one agreed to the comic hero. Screen adaptations of superhero stories were getting a boost, but many actors were afraid to wear panties over their pants. Ben Affleck agreed to do that, who was persuaded by $11 million and a percentage of the box office. And as charges could be huge, Affleck expected to earn money for the rest of his life just by one role. Trying to stand out from the rest, the creators of Daredevil attracted attention to themselves as best they could. A big star in the title role. Soundtrack was written by Evanescence, a band that was at the peak of popularity, and creators promised truly adult vision of superhero. But something didn't work out. The film got trashed in test screenings and was rushed back to the editing table. As a result, 30 minutes were cut from the film. This resulted in a few plot twists being removed from the film and the main line was cutted. As a result, the not too complicated but coherent story turned into a collection of episodes that somehow held on to the general idea. Naturally, such a movie failed at the box office. Audiences berated the caricatured villains, the outdated graphics, and even threw a golden raspberry at Ben Affleck. Even Stan Lee called Daredevil his most unloved film adaptation. With a budget of $78 million and marketing costs of $45 million, film managed to make only $180 at the box office. 2 years later, the studio releases a separate film about Elektra, Matt Murdock's girlfriend. They even cut all of Ben Affleck's appearances from it, in order to keep the film from being affected by the failure of the original. But it didn't help. The failure of Elektra was even louder, but because of the smaller figures spent on production, it was simply forgotten about. The next attempt to bring Daredevil back to screens was in 2015 in the form of a series for Netflix. And that attempt was a successful. Originally only one season was planned. But the series received very high ratings from viewers and was extended for 2 seasons more. Despite the excellent reception from audience, the series was shut down in 2017 due to a greatly increased production budget with lowing views. Jealous of Sony and 20th Century Fox Studios, Warner Studios launched movies about its 2 titular superheroes. Batman Begins, though it barely managed to pay for itself, got a sequel because of the good reviews and faith in a brighter future. And the studio threw everything into promoting of Superman Returns. The original Richard Donner's film changed cinema forever and influenced on many directors. Sam Raimi referred to it in the first Spider-Man. Christopher Nolan was inspired by it when he made Batman Begins. But Bryan Singer was most in love with the original film. And when, after the success of the first part's X-Men franchise, he had the chance to take on a new Man of Steel film, he immediately leaves the mutants. It's somehow forgotten about today, but in year which Superman Returns was premiered, movie got pretty good reviews from critics and audiences alike. An old-fashioned, optimistic and pompous superhero movie everyone liked, and Superman even overtook Batman Begins in box office. The only thing was that the collections of $400 million with a colossal budget of $270 million was obviously not enough. From a financial point of view, it was a huge failure, and the test of time film endured poorly. Superman Returns is indeed an overly old-fashioned film. Singer imitated Richard Donner so fanatically that he copied dialogue, scenes and plot twists from his picture, offering little of his own. Even the lead actor, Brandon Routh, was cast solely because of his resemblance to Christopher Reeve, the star of the original Superman. As a result, we have a very expensive and very lengthy homage. It has almost no action, no fascinating plot, and among the actors, critics praised only one, whose name it is now not common to mention. However, for all its defects, it is not at all the worst movie about hero in the red coat. And if it wasn't for the inflated budget, we probably wouldn't have seen Zack Snyder's version of Superman, and the Bryan Singer-led franchise would have been in works. In the 70s, the superhero fashion went downhill, prompting DC Comics to experiment in other genres. Thus came Jonah Hex, a rugged bounty hunter clearly copied from Clint Eastwood in Sergio Leone's Dollar Trilogy. Not that the character was all that popular, but he was viable enough to go through several relaunches and make appearances in the Batman and Justice League cartoon series. In the wake of the comic book revival, a Jonah Hex adaptation was planned back in the noughties. Then everyone took any book with pictures, for which the producers could get the rights. Matthew McConaughey and Thomas Jane were looking at the project. The film could not get into production for a long time. Sometimes, studio could not find the title actor, or a script does not suit someone. In the end, Warner tired of waiting, and ran the first version of the script and signed Josh Brolin and Megan Fox, and at the roles of villains signed Michael Fassbender and John Malkovich. In those years, Fassbender was not yet a superstar, and Brolin and Malkovich, though considered good actors, but starred mostly in independent films. If the film had gone into production 5 years later, it certainly would have received a bigger budget and a normal advertising campaign. But in 2009, the project was allocated only $35 million, and in the director's chair sat Jimmy Hayward, who only had a Horton cartoon under his belt. What they managed to make this talented group of people showed the test audience the reaction, which became clear that this film is better not to show anyone else. The studio gave Jimmy Hayward another $12 million and sent the film off for a lengthy reshoot, which again did not satisfy anyone. Some people who saw the first draft begged the studio not to release the film. But Warner, hoping to recoup at least some costs, threw Jonah Hex into theaters without promotional support. At the box office, Hex made a humiliating $11 million. Not surprisingly, none of those involved remember this failure in any way. Any of the 4 Fantastic Four movies are worthy of a place on this list, but the version of 2015 is the undoubted favorite. After the failure of Silver Surfer, Fox Studios planned a reboot of the Fantastic Four. Despite the modest receipts of the first film and the outright failure of the second part, the studio believed in the characters. And Fox desired to keep the rights on popular characters. Under the agreement with Marvel Studios, 20th Century Fox must release at least one film every 10 years, or rights would revert back to Marvel, and the deadline was approaching. The studio blames director Joshua Trank for the failure of the reboot, and the director blames the studio for the fact that producers constantly pushing him and not giving him a chance to work his way through the project. The studio's rush is understandable, but another part of the studio's fault was that it had entrusted a big Hollywood blockbuster to an inexperienced director with one small $12 million film under his belt. From Chronicle director, everyone expected a fresh look at the genre, but apparently, he just couldn't handle the pressure. The film had problems even before filming began. Josh Trank had a breakdown with screenwriter Jeremy Slater, whom he originally called into the project himself. The studio replaced Slater with Simon Kinberg, who wrote scripts for the last films in the X-Men franchise and would later direct Dark Phoenix. Trank and Kinberg began to put together Slater's work and, after patching up a couple of plot holes, sent screenplay to work. Next came the problematic casting. The director and the studio argued about each actor approved for role. Some did not suit Trank, others the producers. For the role of Dr. Doom tried the main villain of our time, Mads Mikkelsen. But Mikkelsen dropped out of the project during the audition. Apparently, the script so impressed Mads that he felt himself unworthy of playing a role in a future masterpiece and decided to give way to more talented actors. There was also an unhealthy atmosphere on the set of the film. Josh Trank fought with absolutely everyone on the set. An actress, Kate Mara, crying every day because of the director's attitude. Thus, Trank took revenge on the studio for refusing to take on the role of Allison Williams. Also, on the set between actor Miles Teller and Josh Trank happened a real fight. Teller saw where the movie was going and tried his best to fix the situation, which really pissed off the talented director. Seeing all the problems on the set, the studio asked the director for a draft of the film. At that point, about 2/3 of the film was ready. What Trank managed to shoot was shown to test audiences and the reviews were awful. The studio immediately cut the film's budget by $40 million, ordered to cut 40 minutes and rewrite ending, making it less massive, and ordered to use saved money to reshoot the first half of the film. The original script had a powerful third act that told of the original destruction of an entire city by the main villain. Whatever was left of that idea fit on the poster. Such a plot twist had no place in the film. Josh Trank took offense to such remarks, slammed door loudly and walked off into the sunset. He was quickly replaced by editor Stephen Rivkin, who finished film as he can. 20th Century Fox knew that Fantastic Four turned in a box office flop, so they decided not to convert the film into fashionable 3D format and almost without any advertising support, throwing movie into distribution. The studio had hoped simply not to lose the rights to the superheroes, later cross them with their X-Men franchise and start making money there. As we know, that didn't happen. Now the rights to the Fantastic Four have returned to Marvel, and another reboot is already listed in the next phase of the successful movie universe. Thanks for listening. Subscribe and stay in touch.